Good morning. A warm welcome to the Humanist community in Silicon Valley Sunday Forum. To those joining us on Zoom, my name is Alex Havasi. I'm Vice President of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a secular and reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community. If you've not done so already, membership forms are available on our website at humanist.org. A special welcome to those who are with us for the first time. We invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. You'll find all our events listed on the website, humanist.org. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist community. You can find out how to donate to our organization, again, on our website, www.humanist.org.
So we have a speaker today, Dr. Masuma Ahmed will explain how cerebral spinal fluid in the dura mater of the spinal cord continuously circulates around the brain, keeping it calm and cool. However, the dura mater can rupture, leaking spinal fluid, causing the brain to sag and misbehave. Dr. Masuma Ahmed presents the puzzling behavior of the brain when it lacks spinal fluid using an innovative, artistic, and storytelling approach. Masuma is a physicist and high-tech professional turned artist and writer. She received her PhD in physics from Yale University. She is a self-taught artist who has studied art and creative writing at Stanford, Yale, and the Bangladesh Art Institute. She received many awards for her artwork from international and US galleries. Masuma was one of the 16 artists selected by the city of Palo Alto to paint the BLM mural in the city in 2020. Masuma also painted murals in Palo Alto, Redwood City, and Harlem. She had solo art exhibits in Palo Alto, Redwood City, and San Jose. Masuma was the Artist of the Month in Redwood City for July 2018. Her poems were published in the New York City Poetry Table Anthology and the Waverly Writers Group Poetry Anthology. Masuma captures the voices of women, diasporas, and science through her artworks and writings at New York City Rainbow Faces, www.facebook.com/NYC Rainbow Faces.
Thank you, Humanist community, to give me the opportunities to share some of the patients' experiences with the spinal fluid leak and the confusions in the medical industry that's happening. It's basically talking about the puzzling brain and the mysteries of spinal fluid through my artworks and storytelling. Before I present, I have to make a disclosure. It's not going down.
Oh, guess I'll have to start it again. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Oh, there it is. Okay, let me go back. Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
All right.
thank you. I'm describing the experiences of the patients. They have to deal with the perplexity of the brain when they suffer through CSF leaks. And CSF stands for cerebral spinal fluid. And these experiences are gathered from many different sites relating to CSF leaks and their patients. And the data gathered, I cannot claim they're comprehensive, and there may even have some anomalies. And the brain's nuances for CSF leaks are presented from patients' perspectives and not from neuroscience perspectives. I'm a physicist and not a neuroscientist. So whatever I present will be from the patient's perspective and not from neuroscience. So what are the mysteries of the cerebral spinal fluid in the context of human brain? And why do we have to worry about it or care about it? And where the spinal fluid is coming from? So this is what I'm going to share, as well as I'm going to share through specific events and the symptoms that described for each event, and show what is the confusion that exists in the medical industry, also among the patients as well. Upright headache. And this, I have a painting there also. It shows, I'm going to describe what upright headache is later on, but it shows, it manifests the upright headache. When you lie down, the headache goes away, but when you sit down or stand up, the headache comes back. And it's in an excruciating form. It's not even like dull headache. So this is a description of the ER sign. The neurologist asked the patient to lie down. And he asked, how do you feel now? Oh, I have no headache now. Neurologist said, please sit down. Do you feel any difference? My head hurts. And the patient grabs her head with both hands to relieve the pain in her head. But as soon as she lies down, the headache goes away and it comes back when she sits down. So the neurologist was very confused. He said, this is really confusing. Do you know why you get the headache when you sit up? I don't know, the patient mentioned. You are the neurologist. Please tell me why is causing it. This is quite perplexing. I also don't know why this happens. So let's go to the next scenario. Sound mimicking electrical discharge. It feels like when the patients describe, it's like the electrical, like when you connect the electrical circuit and they're shorted, you get all these noises. So it sounds like, so I tried to capture in my artwork how the electrical current, when it's shorted, feels like. So there is this screeching noise inside the head. And I'll describe why it goes through, what happens. But here I'm going to describe the events to show the patient and the doctor's interactions and show what kind of confusion exists in the medical community. It's in a doctor's office. When she gets in, the nurse takes the blood pressure, vitals, and one of them is the blood pressure. The blood pressure reading was 145/90. And then the doctor in and looks at the vitals and says, the blood pressure is very good. But my blood pressure was very high when I first came in. The patient mentioned, oh, ignore that. That was just an anomaly. You don't have to worry. Your pressure is normal. Doctor, screaming noise inside my head. What is causing it? Oh, that's just tinnitus. The ringing. Many people get it. Doctors don't know it. And there is no treatment for it. You just have, when you get home, just turn on the fan. The noise from the fan will help to tolerate the screaming noise in your head. So you can see I'm building up the confusions that exist and the misunderstanding that exist in the medical community, as well as in the patient's community. Because patients are not familiar with neuroscience or the medical science. So they also try to conjecture what was happening to them. The sound bombarding the head, the patient complains that when they hear sound, it bangs in their head. And that's what I try to capture here. You can see she is submerged in the sea of sound with the longitudinal waves attacking her head. And it's very intolerable to the patient. The audiologist office, another, you have problems with your hearing. The sound causes banging in my head. I cannot tolerate it. It's so painful. You have hearing loss. You need hearing aids. That's what the audiologist said. But hearing aid will magnify the sound, amplify the sound. It will be mournful for my head. Oh, hearing aid will solve all your problems. The audiologist puts the hearing aids to her ears, adjusting the audio level. And this patient screams involuntarily and immediately takes off the hearing aid without even realizing it, because the pain, the sound feels so intolerable to her head. Messed up neuronal circuitry. Again, I'm a physicist and not a neuroscientist, so I try to capture the feeling of the patients, how the neurons get all jumbled up with issues with sound and the noise in our head and the headache, this intense headache. What is happening here is, okay. It is not showing the whole thing, that's why. This is in the neurologist office. The patient already had a blood patch procedure, and she was referred to another physician, another neurologist. So she went to see this neurologist, who is a new neurologist for her perspective. The nurse comes in and takes her vital. Her blood pressure was 120/70. And the neurologist comes in and comments, without even looking at her vitals, you don't have a spinal fluid leak. She is aware of that the patient had gone through the blood patch procedure. The blood patch was unnecessary to suffer from migraine headaches. I never had migraine headache, the patient mentioned. I had always had upright headache, and the blood patch helped with it. It alleviated, not completely, but the intensity of the headache has gone down. Neurologist, no, you have migraine headache, not spinal fluid leakage or upright headache. Failing to convince the neurologist about the improvement, the patient feels very stressed out. And the nurse comes in again and takes her blood pressure. And this time her blood pressure was 135/80. Keep in mind that the patient is very stressed now. When she came in, she was very calm. Her blood pressure is 120/70. So the stress plays a role in raising the blood pressure, I'm assuming. Neurologist, you have vestibular headache. Your blood pressure is very high and you need to take blood pressure medication to lower the blood pressure. Patient feeling stressed and frustrated. But my blood pressure was normal when I first came in. Why are you not mentioning that? And then after she came back home, she did the Google search and found out the neurologist specializes in vestibular and migraine headache and lacks experience with CSF leaks conditions. Oh, I cannot even read the headline. Huh? Oh, okay, turbulent sound waves. Again, I'm presenting how the sound feels like to the head. Again, this is my abstract interpretation using my canvas and paintbrush. So it's just all this jumbled up sound comes to your head and mess up your head. Costco hearing test place. The audiology technician puts the hearing aid in patient ears. Again, the patient involuntarily takes off the screaming loud and involuntarily takes off the hearing aids because she cannot tolerate it. It's not the audiology technician mentioned, you have problems in your inner ears, because he did another test afterwards when the patient could not tolerate the hearing aids. Hearing aids will not help you. You need to fix the problem. You need to see an ENT physician who specialized in inner ears and neurology before you can come back and try out hearing aids. So that's what I'm describing, all the scenarios that the patients have gone through, are going through even now today when they have CSF leaks issue. So here I'm going to read my poem. Confusion, 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 as if there is a nuclear fusion. Longitudinal sound waves compressing and decompressing arm themselves to bombard the neuronal lining. Doctors are amused by the diagnosis uncertainty. Patients' heads are attacked for the lack of fluidity. Patients lament, oh, where shall we go as we cannot stand up? This headache, a monster, our heads cannot scrub. MRI, CT scan, and even blood patches, all are useless. The medical world is oblivious to patients feeling hopeless. Now I'm going to discuss what is a CSF leak, or a tidbit of it. As I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm just mentioning what is CSF leak is from a layperson viewpoint and gathering data from all the CSF sites and also some medical journals. And how does it affect the brain, and what could be the potential treatment for it? Here is the architecture, very simplified architecture of the brain. And I'll go through each one of the architectural elements here, like cranium, cortex, spinal fluid, basal ganglia. What are their functions in the brain? The brain is the most complex organ in the human body, which controls all the human organs. And it consists of more than 100 billion nerves that communicate using trillions of connections known as synapses. And I'll show as you saw, the cortex, I'll go back. The cortex is the upper layer, and which regulates our thought process and the movements, and the brainstem, which lie between the spinal cord and the rest of the brain, regulates our breathing and sleep. And the basal ganglia, which is a cluster of structure in the brain, brainstem, the basal ganglia, which is a structure here, it communicates messages with all the components in the brain. Cerebellum sits at the back of at the base in the back of our head, and it's responsible for the coordination and balance. And the cranium, the skull, which shields our brain from any kind of injury. And the spinal cord transports signals from the brain to all the parts of the body. And the dura is the membrane which contains the spinal fluid. And the spinal fluid, you can see the spinal fluid going all around the brain, cushions the brain and keeps the brain cool and calm. Also, this shows the layers of brain structure. I'm not going to go to it. I'll just show the critical part, which the critical component of the brain, which plays a role, pretty critical role in the spinal fluid issues, is called dura matter. And you can see it has two layers. And in between flows the spinal fluid. It's periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. So you just have to remember the dura matter that plays a very critical role in flowing the spinal fluid, circulating the spinal fluid around the brain. This is the spinal cord. The spinal cord also, which carries the spinal fluid from our spine to the brain. And this shows all the components, and I forgot where I got this from one of the medical journals. And you can see the external layer is the dura. And between dura and anarchoid and arachnoid, there is a space where the spinal fluid is carried. Okay, this again a simplified picture of my painting showing how the spinal cord goes and what is the dura matter. And you can see that black stuff is the dura matter, is the membrane. And the stem is the spinal cord going to the brain. And in between is the spinal fluid, and which goes from all the way through the spine and circulating around the brain. So, but what happens when the dura matter gets ruptured for some reason? An accident can cause it, epidural issue can, injection can cause it. So there are many reasons that dura matter can get ruptured. What happens when that happens? The spinal fluid doesn't flow to the head to keep it calm and cool. So how does the brain react? It's not like the vital components we assume, like the cerebral cortex or cerebellum or ganglia, but you can see the spinal fluid plays a very critical role in keeping the brain functioning. But when the dura matter ruptures, what happens? The spinal fluid leaks out. So the spinal fluid, even if the body continuously is producing spinal fluid, it's leaking out through the holes in the dura matter, and it doesn't reach the brain. And even if when it reaches the brain, it's not sufficient to keep the brain cool and calm. And then all the symptoms that the patients were complaining about start to happen. So that's where the puzzles lies, that the brain, even though it's not the interior component of brain, by keeping the brain cool, the spinal fluid, which is coming from the spine, the brain can function properly. And without it, the brain starts to misbehave tremendously. And sometimes the patients, I remember one of the very well-known writer in Canada, and she was only 26. And suddenly, for some reason, she had a ruptured dura mater, and she was completely bedridden. She couldn't even stand up. So these are the critical issues that the patients face, but the medical community has yet to come on board to recognize the issues, as I mentioned, through all these events, scenes that I described earlier, that is being not well understood as of yet. And I'll do this list some of the medical institutions who are on board with it and recognize it, but there are very few, even across the globe. So patients across the globe come to the United States to those, and there are basically 3 institutions, come to those 3 institutions for treatment and also for diagnosis. So again, I'm going to read another poem, Symbiotic Enamor. Neurons and the spinal fluid moron, they tend to fight head on. Who will win? That has yet to be seen. Need to be close to each other to fight off the predators together. The mantra is to be cool and calm, cannot be disturbed with a tantrum. Dura matter loves in the back while keeping the spinal fluid intact. Any holes in its translucent membrane can start neuronal irritation again. Bowing down to Dura is their only choice. They finally shake hands and pretend to rejoice. However, I kind of focused on spinal fluid leaks, which comes on the spinal fluid, which is caused by the dura mater rupture. And that's called spinal CSF leaks. But then there is also cranial CSF leaks, which happens a lot of time, which happens directly to the head, that the skull get broken up and penetrate the dura mater there and causes problem there. And I'm not going to focus on cranial CSF leaks because that's kind of well understood in the medical community because there are so many auto accidents and people get so many head injuries. So, and some of the symptoms overlap, but a lot of the symptoms do not overlap. So spinal CSF leaks is not that well understood compared to the cranial CSF leaks. So I'm just going to focus on spinal CSF leaks. And as you can see, it's coming from the spine. And even though even in the cranial CSF leaks, the spinal fluid is coming from the spine, but the injury is happening directly to the brain, not to the spine or to the spinal cord. What are the symptoms of the spinal CSF leaks? The most prominent one is the upright headache. When the patient lies down, it either goes away or it goes down that the patient can cope with it. But it comes back when the patient sits down or stands up. And other issues like neck and shoulder pain, ringing in ears, sound intolerance, changes in hearing, dizziness, nausea or vomiting, changes in vision, as well as cognitive behavior may also be impacted because of the lack of spinal fluid in the brain. So this is from one of the CSF Leaks Foundation. And this is so I just copied here for the facts to share some of the facts of the CSF leaks issues. Is 5 in 100,000 people each year are affected by it, by this CSF, spinal CSF leaks. And they are not rare, but are generally underdiagnosed, misdiagnosed as migraines, sinusitis, NPODH, tension, and other headache disorders. And it usually takes about 13 months to diagnose it, even to diagnose it after it happens. So you can see, as I said, it's not well understood, even though it's not that rare of a disease. But it's, and even then I'll discuss the treatments and cannot cure everything as of yet. So this CSF leak issue is not basically not in the mainstream in the medical community as of yet. So what are the treatments? The first attempt they usually take is the epidural. Oh no, the causes, sorry, I forgot. This is the epidural injection. Like a lot of women, when they give childbirth to relieve the pain, they injected epidural medications into the spine, and that can rupture the dura matter. A lumbar puncture, similar to epidural, for some reason to correct like Elmer disease and other diseases, they will puncture and they will inject a needle into the dura mater and can puncture the dura mater there. An injury to the spine, and people born with or develop abnormalities in the dura mater that can cause damage to the dura mater, because it's a very sensitive membrane that covers the spinal fluid and contains that spinal fluid. And then there is called fistulas. What happened is the dura mater connect with the veins and gets ruptured, but it's go all the way to the extreme of the body. And that's called CSF venous fistulas. And then any kind of surgery of the spine can cause CSF leak issues. How do they get diagnosed? The first step is to do an MRI with a contrast. And they do both for head as well as for the spine. But why head? Not just spine, to find out whether there is leak there. And this is the first attempt, but usually I would say, I should not quote, but most of the time it doesn't get diagnosed. MRI is not as, the resolution is not as good to see if there is a hole in the dura mater. So what happened to the head is that when the head lacks the spinal fluid, it starts to sag. The brain starts to sag. So that's one indication that there is a spinal fluid leakage somewhere, even though it doesn't localize where it is, but it shows that there is a spinal fluid leakage. And another is that if you remember the architecture, the simplified architecture of the brain that I showed, the spinal fluid goes all the way to the pituitary gland. And that pituitary gland gets also affected when there is a shortage of spinal fluid. And the MRI can detect that as well when it is with contrast. So that's why they do the head MRI in addition to the spinal MRI. And when MRI cannot work and doesn't find anything, and the patient still complains, the next step is to do radioisotope cysternography. It's not being used that much, but some institutions use it. For example, I guess the one in Minneapolis, you know that, what is the name of that, Dana? Huh? I'll mention later on, you'll see it's there. So that's, but again, it has to poke into the dura mater, and then still there is the danger. It can also rupture the dura mater as well. The most prominent one, if everything fails, is called myelography, which uses digital subtraction fluoroscopy along with the CT scan or MRI scan, and a contrast to look by puncturing again the dura mater to locate the hole in the dura matter. But the problem is that it can also cause additional damage to the dura as well. But a lot of time it also cannot locate. The fish and the hole may be so small that the resolution cannot identify it. And then the spinal tab, which is the lumbar puncture, again, placing a needle to locate the where the CSF leak is happening, because you need to locate where is it happening to do the treatment. It's not just, the first one is not even try to locate it. The first one is more like seeing whether there is a CSF leak through the looking at all the abnormalities in the brain as well as in the spine. So what are the options for the patients? What are the treatments? Complete bed rest, sometimes that helps. And I recollect the patient, a Chinese man, he stayed in bed for 1 year, complete bed rest for 1 year to get cured, because sometimes that hole can cure itself. And another patient in UK, she is still undergoing. She stayed in bed for 3 months straight, never got up. And then also she changed her diet to see whether that will help, because she's a nutritionist. So you can see the patients, to relieve themselves, try all these other options to see whether they can tolerate these symptoms, this severe headache, as well as the other issues like ringing and the sound issues, as well as the cognitive issues. And sometimes it does help, like for the Chinese man who stayed in bed for 1 year, did help. So it cannot be ruled out. So the first attempt the patients take is complete bed rest. And how long you do it, how you do it, all depends on that. And then the next step is the epidural blood patch, where the physicians or the neurosurgeon takes the blood from the patient and inject that, and the blood will clot around the, hoping that the blood will clot around the holes and covering it up. But the issues with the blood patch is that first, it's not localized. They just inject, assuming that it will cover up the blood, a hole of the dura mater, and then it can rupture. The blood is not permanent in terms of clotting. It clots, but it can break. So a lot of people, the symptoms come back within a week. Some people, it never helps. Some people can feel fine for 2 years and then it comes back. So it varies with patients. And yes.
Could that cause a stroke if a clot breaks off?
Huh?
You're gonna have to repeat his question if you're gonna take part of the floor.
Okay.
Could it cause a stroke to have blood
From the clot.
from the clot if part of the clot breaks off?
I don't know really, but it's in the spine, not in the head.
Could it get
The
into
clot,
capillary?
it can flow, I'm assuming, but so far I have not heard of it. It's a good question, no doubt, but as you said, it can cause stroke if the spinal fluid if the clot goes all the way to the brain, but it's in the spine, not and it's a very small amount, which is, and with the hope, they cannot localize it with all these informations, because myelographing that I mentioned, physicians also don't want to do it until it is absolutely necessary. So they want to rely on symptoms the patients complain about, and also on the MRI. Even though MRI resolution is not good enough to localize or find out where the damage has happened. And then the next step they take is to mix a sealant with the patient's blood and inject it. And apparently that works better than the just natural blood. That clot may remain more, the longevity of that clot to stay in place is longer than the natural blood. But again, that can break as well. And some people don't even ever get any relief from that either. So the next course is really the surgery, which means you open up the spinal cord and do grafting there, assuming that you have detected and localized and found where the rupture has happened, to cure that with a surgery using patient's muscles and the fat to cover it up. And then the transvenous embolization. I'm not that familiar with that one. So it's the catheter-based treatment for CSF venous fistulas. As I mentioned, there is this connection formed between the veins and the dura and the dura mater or the CSF leaks. And that's being trying to be corrected using transvenous embolization. And as I mentioned, all of these treatments, especially the epidural blood patch and sealant, they are temporary and doesn't really cure or make the patients feel better permanently. So surgery is the next recourse. And even that, there is no 100% guarantee that will work. So I took up the names of the patient or the site that I usually visit, and I want to give some of the patient's information, their direct. So I'm going to read it to you now. Early on, when I first developed a leak, I began taking collagen. I took it because I had broke my tailbone and thought the collagen could help tighten the ligament. And by the way, I did find out after reading that, that in the sports medicine, they use collagen for the sports people because it tightens the muscles, which is helpful in the sports industry. So there is some authenticity, what she was mentioning here. My leak symptoms started just 2 months after I idiopathically broke my tailbone. So I knew it was related. What I didn't expect was just 2 days after starting the collagen, all my leak symptoms disappeared and stayed gone. I had no idea my headache, sweats, fatigue, nausea, nervousness, and shortness of breath was a leak at the time. I just knew that the collagen helped me. About 6 months later, I stopped taking the collagen, and the symptoms stayed gone until I started working out and felt a huge pop, and all symptoms immediately came back, plus vomiting. That is now 4 years later, I suspect a huge tear now, and collagen cannot touch it. But I suspect those of you suffering from smaller leaks could really benefit. So this is basically describing her experience and what treatment she had personally did herself, and when it worked and when it didn't work. And I wanted to show this information because these are the information that the patients share with each other at the site. I'll mention what are the sites I did visit. And I didn't visit many of the sites, but some of the sites. And I also like to mention that if I recollect, Microsoft took an initiative to gather data from all these patient sites because they felt that there are a lot of very useful and helpful information that the medical industry need to get in touch with what the patients are describing. And a lot of this information is really authentic because they're dealing with day-to-day basis. And there are a lot of data that can be used in the medical industry to come up with treatment or even diagnostic tools for these patients, for the diseases that these patients have gone through. And this is not just specifically to CSF-leak patients, but across the board of any other diseases. There are many sites on all different diseases. And Microsoft, I don't know how far they have gone along, but they have looked into and gathering data from all these sites and filtering out to see how those information can be used in the industry to come up with diagnostic tools as well as treatment issues. So again, I'm going back. This is a positive note. It's a picture I've taken somewhere and then I painted it. It's a house. It feels like almost like a fairy's house with all these decorations all over. So someone's house. On a lazy afternoon stroll, it's someone's house at the corner of the sidewalk, dance in my violet heart. I cross the street and start singing a love song. Grandma has put together orange folklore in the front yard, stringing a ballad sung by fairies. My joyous encounter discovers the invisible path to the Hansel and Gretel's magical home. Mesmerized, the brain silently stops, misfiring synapses, and constant shrieking in neuronal whispers discharging across the cerebral cortex, and gives me a break from the eternal ringing in my head. Happiness returns to me in silence, embraced in the arms of the evening sun. The folktale garden, dressed in shaded green and wearing silvery ornaments hung from the branches of red trees, challenges the rebuke posed by the dying god in my head. Closing my eyes, I see someone's house again, filled with blue desires and the quintessential love in his intimate scent. Wonders ramped in deep rubbly waves quietly tiptoe into my dilapidated head. Coming down, jittery accents welcome the beautiful gesture with a smile. Let the turbulence find shelter somewhere else. Okay, these are the sites that I mentioned who are in the forefront of treating CSF patients and doing a lot of research into that area as well. Basically, the first three, Cedars-Sinai, which is the leader, which really the leader in the CSF leak initiatives, and led by Dr. Udo Shevnik, and he's well-known, very well-known in the global medical community because, as I mentioned, patients from Australia, UK, Scotland come to the United States for treatment, for diagnosis. And then the Duke Medical, which is led by Dr. Linda Gray in North Carolina. These are the top two. And then Stanford doesn't do any kind of surgery. So Stanford is just coming on board and led by Dr. Ian Carroll. And then there are some coming up is Mayo Clinic. That's what I mentioned earlier about, which is in Minneapolis and also in Rochester. And then Johns Hopkins Hospital. But they're just coming on board. They're still not in the mainstream in terms of diagnosis and treating CSF leaks patients. And these are some of the sites, CSF link sites that I mentioned earlier and take data from. One is the Spinal CSF Foundation, and the link is there as well. And the other one is Team Inspire, is primarily patients organized and patients input there. And there are Facebook sites also, CSF Links International and CSF Links Private Group. And the links are there if anybody is curious to find more about these sites. And these are some of the references I'm quoting where I gathered not the data primarily, gathered the data, but also the pictures of the brain and all this stuff. And also I did the painting using their pictures as well. Okay, thank you very much. And if you like portraying science using art and storytelling, please, I invite you to visit my site called New York City Rainbow Faces, and the link is there. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of the patients' experiences with you.
Yeah, thank you, Masuma.
Are you
do
gonna
seem-
do Q&A?
Excuse me?
Are you gonna do questions?
I'm short of hearing, so yeah.
Questions.
Huh?
Are you taking questions?
Oh, yes. I don't know whether I'll be able to answer most of them because I'm not a neuroscientist. I can relate to patients' experience and I can share those.
My
But
question is about the, sorry.
yeah, you have to use that. I'm sorry.
My question is about using the, on the last treatment that you listed, using the fistula that's caused by the leak, okay? And then it said something about embolism, so I assume that means clot.
Yeah.
So is that treatment that they are finding where the fistula is and then using it to put a blood clot on the spine?
Most probably, as I said, this is the embolism treatment. I'm not that familiar with it. I'm more familiar with the MRI, the blood patch sealant and myelography, as I
Yeah,
mentioned.
but obviously if there's a fistula coming from
Yeah,
the spine,
exactly.
it must
Yeah,
be
yeah,
spinal fluid.
yeah.
And that would be a direct indication
Yeah,
that there might be a leak there.
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I was thinking that obviously the body is generating more spinal fluid. You need more as you grow. And
Excuse
so
me?
I say the body is always generating some spinal fluid. So this is not, I would assume a small pinhole tear would not be that serious. The body should be able to compensate for that.
Oh, no.
No?
It could be a pinhole. It still will be, and as you saw, that's why I showed the spinal cord. You see so many layers there. So it's very, very difficult to localize or pinpoint where the damage was made and to rectify that.
Okay, could this be a fatal condition if the tear is large enough?
Excuse me?
I say if the tear is large enough, could this be a fatal condition?
Yeah, because if you lack fluid in your brain,
Yeah.
the brain will charge. As I said, the brain sags. So that's already a very critical situation.
Yeah, is there have to be permanent damage even if you repair the fistula?
Yeah, it can.
Okay.
People suffer from many, many years and misdiagnosed. I didn't mention all those information, but as one patient was mentioning that she got relief after taking collagen, but then it recurred and the tear was much larger, she assumed. But a lot of time, they are not even diagnosed properly. As I said, like they're attributed to migraine headache, they're attributed to other forms of issues, and even stroke issues. So it's difficult even to diagnose the disease or the damage.
The standing headache sounded kind of unique. I would think that the standing headaches, that sounded like a unique condition. I assume that would
Oh,
Change
yes,
Dr.
yes,
Dudley.
but even then, as I showed one of the neurologists visit, she completely denied that there is a that's caused by upright and the CSF leaks. She was adamant that it is migraine or the vestibular headache. So because after reading all this stuff, what I found out that you really need two things here. One is the understanding of not only of the symptoms, but also how does it work? Because our body is a holistic, you have to take a holistic approach. And a lot of the time, what I found, like I mentioned one of the scene at the ER, they just focused on the brain itself. Don't look at how is it interrelated throughout the whole body. So he could not even, so that patient I found out was treated for stroke. So because they are not relating to the spinal fluid to the brain to see that can cause any symptoms, because that has not been studied or researched as vigorously as other areas like stroke, because that's much more damaging than, say, CSF leak shortage, one thing, and then it happens a lot more, the frequency of happening stroke is a lot more than CSF leak issues.
Okay, are there people that can raise your hand if you have any questions or comments? I was, this kind of reminds me of something House would deal with in the TV show. He always misdiagnoses something right in the beginning of the program and ends up discovering some rare condition.
Once you tell them how to raise their hand, maybe they forgot.
Okay, yeah. So to raise your hand, if you go to the bottom of your screen where the menu will appear, go to the reactions button. Click on that, it'll give you a menu, and one of those should be raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll start calling on you. Les.
There's one person in the chat. Do we want to read?
Yeah, there is chat. So some people, you have to open up the chat to see.
And something.
It's about voting. You see, the neurologist whose specialty doesn't cover this or that type of condition has a hammer and nail attitude. It seems, which causes a patient to struggle longer to get an accurate diagnosis. Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that's true. That's happening when I go to visit all these sites, all the patients, and they have been suffering for 3 or 4 years. It's not just 1 year or 6 months.
Yeah,
And they're still misdiagnosed, still not treated well, and saying it's in their head. And if you're a woman, it's even worse. It's a psychological problem with women, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that one of the worst things is going to the doctor with some problem and having him tell you you're fine. There's nothing wrong with you.
Yeah. And even like I found out Dr. Ian Carroll at Stanford, his young daughter, who was 10 or 11, was suffering from it. And he was an anesthesiologist. He was the first to diagnose her daughter himself. And he went back to medical school and got an MS in neurology to treat his daughter.
Les, I see you've got your hand up.
Huh?
Someone on the screen. Les, you've got your hand up. You're still muted. Les, you're still muted.
Oh, sorry. Want
Okay.
to thank you for your talk. I have been a victim twice of this problem once about 60 years ago, and again a couple of months ago. And your suggestions will help me find a solution, I believe. It has been a tough situation, and I currently cannot walk without a walker, but I'm determined to beat the rap, and you have made a number of suggestions that will help me get there, I think. So thank you.
Yeah.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Liz. Susan, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, I thought a great talk. I really like your talk with all the slides and
Thank
the
you.
pictures, and it's amazing. Your creativity is amazing. The one thing about the collagen sort of perked me up, thinking, oh, you can just go to Amazon and get some.
Yes, you can even go to Costco, they sell it.
Right. But how do you know what is the adverse effects of collagen? You may not know this, but
Yeah.
it's just that self-administering medicines like that
Exactly, but
can have some counter effects. And the other thing is, I didn't know that the sports medicine and so forth do collagen injections. I have to talk to my sports medicine guy that I saw this week. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I usually try not just to take it at face value. I also do some Google search and research to see what is the authenticity of those data. And that's how I found out that in the sports medicine, they use collagen, they inject players with the collagen.
Fran,
And also I found out recently that as you get older, a lot of aging population start to take collagen to get our skin firmer.
Fran, you've got your hand up.
Hi. As Masuma knows, my daughter was diagnosed with spinal fluid leaks. She had 3 blood blocks with Dr. Ian Carroll at Stanford. Nothing helped. And she was sent down to Cedars-Sinai, where they determined that she did not have a spinal fluid leak. And she has been diagnosed with an autoimmune disease and is being treated for that, and is doing pretty well now. That's it.
Okay, Oded.
Yeah, I have some question. Friend of my father 50 years ago have used lots of headache, and they finally get surgery. They cut a nerve on his face, and then the headache go away. Could you please explain why?
I didn't get the question, if you don't mind, please.
I think
I'll repeat. A person get lots of migraine and headache. The doctor cut a nerve in his face, and then the headache gone away.
he says he got headaches. Doctor cut the nerves in his face and it cleared the headaches.
It cured the headache.
Yeah.
Oh, there are issues with the inner ears, and this may not be CSF leaks. I read something about, I'm getting interested in neurology, so I read that in the inner ear, there are called, so I forgot the name of it. So it mimics like the CSF leaks symptoms, but it's not really a CSF leak issue. It's something to do with the inner ear. So, and I'm glad that your symptoms were elevated, going through the surgery, but it sounds like it's not really a CSF leak issue. It's something to do with the inner ear issues. Yeah.
I was, one of the takeaways that I'm thinking about is, what are your thoughts about epidurals? Should they be completely banned or only utilize with consultation with several other professional doctors.
I agree with you, yeah, because right now, like when women go to give childbirth, one options right away is offered is to go through epidural, and they never consult anyone else. It's done by the obstetrician, and I'm not sure whether they're that familiar with the spinal cord or the issues with the spinal fluid. So yeah, I agree with you that that should be in consultation with a neurologist.
Sister-in-law
Who had gone through it.
because of that.
Yeah, a lot of women, CSF. Another thing I didn't show, and the statistics shows is a lot more women who suffer from these issues, and a lot of them have gotten it through these epidural injections.
So I think my takeaway from this is CSF leak is something that should be considered if you have these symptoms, but often it's not CSF leak, it could be something else. And when you look at things like collagen, the woman had relief for a while, but then had a much more serious problem. And do we know that that's not caused by the collagen? So there's a lot that's not known yet.
No.
And with the pregnancy spinal injection, it would be interesting to know how many of those are done versus how many result in CSF leaks.
First of all, the first question you mentioned about the collagen, that whether that caused her tear later on, but she stopped taking it and she started doing exercise, running, and she had gone back to work. So these are the stuff. So instead of just focusing on a collagen and not ignoring the fact that she started to run, she started to do vigorous exercise again. We have to take into account of all this data to see whether that has caused the problem. And the collagen didn't help afterwards because the tear was too wide. If it was just a tiny hole, it might have helped. But if your tear is much larger, collagen cannot help. You may eventually even blood patch will not help in that case. She may have to go through surgery, opening up her spine. That will be my, not being a neurologist, that would be my 2 cents from a physicist point of view or from a scientist point of view.
I have 2 more questions and we'll
Yeah.
stop.
You mentioned a number, I thought it was 500,000 or something, the incidence of the CSF. Is that the number you said? It was some big number, but I'm not sure what the percentage is,
I'm not sure. I didn't gather that.
That's just a number to me. I don't know how to quantify it with just that number.
Yeah,
that's all.
I agree because I didn't, because I wanted to focus on the patient's experience and not to those kind of statistical data. But I did quote from CSS Foundation one that 5 in 100,000 in the US happen every year. And it's not rare, but it's not like in the mainstream, like the stroke, for example.
All right, Helen, you get the last word.
Yeah, I was suggested an epidural when I had major pain from some compression fractures from falling on my behind situation. But I was told, that's a way to go, but it is not the first thing you want to do. So doctors will tell you that it's not the best thing to have happen to try to avoid it at all costs. So it's not like they just say, oh, you can have an epidural.
I didn't hear her what she said. Sorry about it.
I just said, I just said that the doctor I had about pain from compression fracture, where all the kind of vertebrae are close together and kind of crunched. I was suggested to have an epidural, but they said, no, that's not the first thing you want to think about. It's sort of the last thing you would think about.
I know, yeah, a lot of people do go through spinal tap without realizing, because the physicians, like, for example, when I gave birth to my daughter, I did have an epidural and I didn't have a clue. The doctor just said that, oh, to relieve your pain, you can, I'll do the epidural, and that's it. No consultation, nothing, the danger associated with it. And I guess it was 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. So they are not even aware of it. And even today, as I mentioned, I just share some of the scenarios. And these are real based on actual events. It's not just from my head. Even today, the physicians do not acknowledge what can happen, or what are the symptoms associated with leaking spinal fluid.
Okay, well, that was a very interesting talk. We learned
Thank
a
you.
lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Masuma.